Where is my gun? Are you gonna No, I'm just kidding. Okay. I would not be shot. Go on. That's why you and him are like a legitimate brother and sister, and so like I could really oh, I kind of gotta do something, but then why?
I'll tell you the keys, Meg, but that's why he's not here today. Streaming 7.
Good old Mike Willoughby.
APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Concili Incorporated is Nevada's premier Democratic campaign firm, fighting for progressive issues and candidates for over a decade, and proud sponsor of Battleborn Progress.
This episode of Out in Front brought to you by
Concili Inc., Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt, as well as our episode sponsors, Save Lives Nevada and Washoe Education Association.
Annette. My name is Annette Magnus, and I'm the Executive Director of Battleborn Progress. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this important episode tonight with some of my favorite people in Nevada. I am so honored to be able to share this space with some of my favorite women who are just badasses and do so much for the state of Nevada. The first person is Taylor Patterson. She is on our board for Battleborn Progress, but she's also the executive director of Native Voters Alliance of Nevada. So Taylor, welcome back to the show for all your hot takes. I'm so excited to have you. We also have one of my very dear friends, Barb Hartzell. She's a community activist. She's been involved in lots of different causes, and she's on the board of NBAN. And then we have Jeanette Patty. She is a community organizer for Native Voters Alliance of Nevada, and she is also with Indigenous Rising, or Indigenous Women Rising, who has an abortion fund. So we're going to talk about that decision and more. So lots of good information to come. This is our special for 4th of July because we wanted to talk about how this land that we're on is actually Indigenous land, and it belongs to these fine women right here. So Taylor, I want to bring you in. You and I conjured up this hot take session earlier in the week because we were pissed off at the Supreme Court, which we've been all week and continue to be today. So I wanted to bring you in so you can help me start this episode, and then we'll move to our other fabulous guests. So let's talk about everything that's going on with the Supreme Court. It's been a wild couple of weeks, especially with SCOTUS. And today they made some additional decisions around the EPA. And we found out that next term, they're going to take up some election rights or voting rights issues. So what is your hot take on the Supreme Court right now?
First of all, thank you for having me. You know, I love the show, and I just already need to get it out into the universe that I am being recorded. So this is not just a fun smack talking chat between me and my closest friends because I have to remind myself I am being recorded. But I will say I'm not surprised by the Supreme Court, and that's unfortunate. I think I've been seeing a lot from my middle class white liberal friends about the just complete disenchantment about the system. And I'm like, wow, must be interesting to feel that way for the very first time. So it is quite fascinating to see people catch up with this idea that there is no bodily autonomy, there is no sovereignty, there is no rights that we have in this country. And I think we're having a rough week with the Supreme Court in general, but particularly with tribal issues, we're having a really hard time. Just recently, they rolled back some of the historic wins from the McGritt decision, and we're going to see a lot of issues with just tribal governance in general. Our sovereign lands are under attack, and they're coming for the Indian Child Welfare Act next, which is very worrisome. And so I think this is just the first set of awfulness, and we still have a lot more to come.
Yeah, I want to get your hot take on this, Taylor, before we move to our other folks tonight. You know, one of the things that really has kind of irritated me the past week is the usage of the imagery from the Handmaid's Tale. And this is something that particularly white women love to do. And it just chaps my ass every time I see it. Because, you know, The Handmaid's Tale is nothing new for Indigenous women or Black women or any other woman or person of color or minority person in this country who has experienced having, you know, a uterus and not having rights. So for me, it's just like, yeah, well, like, I don't understand how they don't understand, I guess, even as a white person. That this country has never been accepting of women of color or people of color or minority folks. So like, I don't know. It's chapped my ass all week since I've seen it. And it's since they started using it. So just wondering what your hot take on it is.
I mean, there's not really even a hot take on that. You've seen me very politely correct a sitting congressperson at a recent Battleborn progress panel, because I hate that. And it's interesting because it's been Handmaid's Tale for a long time for us, but it also hasn't been, because I shared on that same panel my mom's sterilization story and how as a low-income woman, she wasn't given the choice whether to be sterilized or not. It was, you want to take advantage of these programs, then you're going to be sterilized. I have a staff member that was nearly sterilized by Indian Health Services. I have many friends and family that share that same story of nearly being sterilized by government programs. And so they've been very clear that they don't want our babies. They don't want Black babies. They don't want like brown or Indigenous babies. They want white babies, period. And I think it's really interesting because, of course, everybody only knows what they know, right? But I think it's really hard to live in your own bubble of privilege. And I think all of us on this panel have different sets of privilege and different things that we don't necessarily see on the outside. But I think this is one of the very first time that these white liberal women are understanding that this country was not made for them. You know, we were merciless Indian savages in the Declaration of Independence. And, you know, I don't think the Declaration of Independence was really written for those people either. Now, do they have an extreme amount of privilege that's clearly showing right now? Absolutely. But I think it's becoming clear that, you know, this land was not made for you and me. It was made for, you know, the white men who wrote the Constitution.
Speaking of, tell your white husband in the background, I said hello and I love him because I can see him in the mirror.
I was like, I don't think you can see. He's making me dinner right now just to put him in his white
That's
place.
Right. Good house husband, as I call I love him, but you know, they got to know their place. Barb, I want to bring you in. Thank you for joining us tonight. One of my besties in the movement. Talk about the importance of tribal communities having sovereignty and, you know, some of the conversations we were having this week, Barb, around the importance of recognizing tribal nations as sovereign governments, but also the ironicness of Neil Gorsuch not understanding that women's bodies should be sovereign, but, you know, tribal governments are.
Definitely. So sovereignty is extremely important to our nations, specifically because of how we became sovereign nations. We became sovereign nations by being forced off of our ancestral lands, being moved into places that we did not want to be. And so when it came to after termination era, where they decided, you know what, we put you on these military reserves, we guarded you like cattle where you could not leave. We took your children and forced them into residential school systems where they would not come home. And if they did, it was pretty brutal. And we're going to now let you form yourselves as sovereign nations, and that this will be a government to government relation. And so by rolling that back and not giving tribes what you agreed upon after the grievances and the terror that you've laid upon our ancestors and our homes, and that many of us, you know, are still reconnecting to our roots. Many of us have been able to stay strong and stand firm where our roots are. But the reality is, like, those came from our treaty rights of being the original people of these lands. And then the brutality of mass genocide that was here, and the forced removal and forced relocation. And so sovereignty is extremely important because it was guaranteed. It's a guaranteed right. Treaties are the law of the land. They supersede your Supreme Court because they are the law of the land. They are here beyond that. So them having a decision to all of a sudden say what they get to dictate to our rights to us is pretty. It's a pretty. I'm not surprised, but really, wow, that's pretty amazing. Where did you get those rights at? I'd like to know.
Yeah. And also, I love your dog in the background being mad about this too. That dog is channeling my energy. Barb, so we were talking via text message when the Oklahoma court case came out this week that basically challenged the sovereignty in Oklahoma of some of the tribal nations. And, you know, we kind of did a deep dive into like how ironic it was that Neil Gorsuch wrote the dissent on that, and he understands the importance of tribal sovereignty. But yet he voted with the majority on the Roe versus Wade case and can't understand autonomy of a woman's body. And it's not all that different, really, you know, recognizing tribal governments, recognizing them as sovereign governments that were here far before anything else was here, and also recognizing bodily autonomy and a person's right to make choices about their body. It's not all that different. So explain that to our viewers and how that kind of is ironic to us.
Yeah, reading his dissent and saying that where tribes are sovereign nations and they have the right to govern, and it is a government to government relation. And I was like, it's pretty interesting that you could see that a tribe has that right, that autonomy to govern their nation, but you do not see that women have the right to govern their bodies. That you should see it as a sovereign nation, and it is a government to government because it is a relationship, because no human should actually be dictating or determining what rights another human has to begin with. So the interesting thing of his dissent of saying that, like, I completely understand and I could see, and this is not right, but yet you're going to vote on the fact that women do not have bodily autonomy, nor do they have the rights to govern their sovereign body.
Yeah, it was really something else. All right, Jeanette, I want to bring you in. I know you do a lot of work with Taylor, with NVAN, but you're also doing a lot of abortion work, really important abortion work, with an abortion fund that's specifically working to help Indigenous people. So talk to us about your reaction to the Supreme Court decision this week, specifically Roe v. Wade, that decision in the Dobbs case, and how that's impacted you as an Indigenous person working on these issues.
So it's been a big whirlwind of emotions. When we first heard the news, it really, of course, it wasn't a surprise at all. Our organization had been preparing for this ever since, since last year. As an Indigenous organization, we knew that, no rights are ever secured just because of our experiences with it. And just to give a little bit of a background about Indigenous Women Rising, because not a lot of folks know about who we are. So we're a nationwide abortion fund. We're there's only 2 nationwide abortion funds in the nation. There's the National Abortion Federation, which they also provide practical support funds and abortion funds, which is paying directly for the clinic directly for the cost of an appointment. So we offer funds for appointments for folks, and then we also provide practical support for travel for covering those costs for folks. And so we've been operating since 2018, the Abortion Fund, and we're overall just a reproductive justice organization. We have a midwifery fund, we have an abortion fund, and then we also have culturally centered sex education. So it's very well-rounded and a bunch of wonderful, I say, Indigibaddies that I get to work with. And I get to do that at NVAN, so it's nice to have Indigibaddies all around me. It's amazing. So that's what the work that Indigenous Women Rising does, just to put a little plug out there. Anybody you know who's Indigenous who needs help with their abortion, definitely send them our way. We're online, we have Instagram, all those good things. But I started working with them September 1st. That's when it was right when the SB 8 law in Texas went into effect. So it was definitely being thrown into the fire. And the beginning, what we were doing, ever since I came on, they've been preparing me for the overturn of Roe v. Wade. And so we have been planning for this for a very long time. And I have to say that there was something that was very aggravating about all of it. I mean, aside from the whole overturn of it all, but definitely was the kind of white liberal reaction to it, that it wasn't expected whatsoever, which it's ridiculous. I don't know how you're doing this work and you don't expect that, to know that that was on the docket. That's what they're gonna, Monday or Friday, it was going to be the decision day. So we were just waiting for the news to kind of happen. And of course, it's incredibly disheartening, but you know what? We all got back to work that day. I was helping clients that day. There was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of stress. There was just a lot of anxiety. I work directly with clients and with clinics. So clients will contact the warm line. They'll talk to me. I'll walk them through the process of whatever help they need. If they have any questions about the process of having an abortion and medication or a surgical abortion, I walk them through that as well. And yeah, so I did that on decision day. Of course, like when I first heard the news, I cried, just an angry cry. I called my cousin. I was like, it finally happened. It's finally here. Now it's time to put everything into practice and get ready for everybody to run around like chickens with their heads off. And I did. And then I also was like texting Taylor, and I was like, I was giving them day-to-day updates about everything, but it was a lot of confusion. People's appointments were getting canceled that day and they were freaking out. And, you know, a lot of these folks, like they had their appointments the next day, and they had finally got the funds for it. They had finally gotten the appointment handled. They'd finally gotten childcare. Everything was finally lined up, and they just had to, wait till the next day. And then with the decision, clinics were canceling appointments because they were worried, and they didn't know how like trigger ban laws were going to be going into place, when they would be going into place. I know that like there was some issues with Utah where they had to get they had to sue everything, and it was a lot, and it's been a lot. It's kind of like it's been a long week of just working since then, and it's been continuing on. But yeah, that's a little bit about what was happening that day at an abortion fund.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jeanette. I don't know how anybody was shocked. It is interesting how it doesn't take the sting off, I guess, right? Especially as somebody who's done abortion work and reproductive rights work for a very long time, even in my previous life before BBP. But I always wondered what it would be like if Roe fell, and like what that reaction would be from me, because we always knew it was a possibility. I mean, that's what we've been ramping for 20 years. And you're right. I cried. I was pissed. I was upset. I'm still pissed. I'm still upset. I don't think that'll ever go away, but it wasn't a surprise and it wasn't a shock, to me at least. So I don't get it. If folks, hang on one second, Taylor. If folks want to support the abortion fund, where do folks go? Because we want to be able to put it in the chat and support your good work.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have all forms of social media: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Indigenous Woman Rising. I think Twitter is at IW Rising. Our link tree has our donation link, and please just donate funds. Don't try to have your own moment of camping, all those weird things. You're strangers. People don't know you. Just donate the funds to organizations that have been doing the work for years and who already have the infrastructure, who already have the vetting process, who already have everything in place to help people. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Just donate funds to abortion funds that are doing the work. And then as well, go ahead and share about abortion funds as well, because we're trying to get more folks to know about us. We have helped a lot of abortion seekers since I started, since September 1st till about now. I think it's getting a little bit closer to 600 folks that we've been able to fund their abortions, either at full cost or majority of the cost. And if they needed travel, we were able to cover the full cost of their plane, train, bus ticket, their full cost of their hotel, and give them some funds for childcare and food. And if donating funds is too boring for you and you want to get involved in a more exciting way, then host a fundraiser or something like that.
Absolutely. And for those who are on the chat right now, the link is in the chat. Also, the link to their website is in the chat. please go on, check them out, check all the good work that they're doing. If you want to donate here in Nevada, the Wild West Abortion Fund is also accepting donations. Again, like Jeanette said, it's not your time to have a moment. It's your time to hunker down and do the work. And the work that's needed is to get as many funds into these organizations as possible so that we can get people abortions if they need them, both here in Nevada and out of state, because we're going to need to help other folks all around the country. Jeanette, I have one more question for you, because this is something that's also been on my mind all week. And I'm just wondering how you feel as an Indigenous person. You know, there was a case decided this week around religion, specifically a football coach being able to pray before he goes on the field or whatever it is. And it was, you know, put out there as this freedom of religion case. He is able to practice his freedom of religion. My question to you is, as an Indigenous person who is helping people access abortion, where do Indigenous folks fall on the spectrum of religion as it relates to abortion? I know we've talked with some of our staff members who are Jewish, who believe that life begins at the first breath, and that the life of the mother should always be taken into consideration when making that decision. Where are Indigenous folks on that?
So there's no like blanket statement for it. It definitely varies tribe by tribe. I know that I've talked to, because like I'm Navajo, and so I have been able to talk to Navajo midwives and Navajo doulas and like full spectrum doulas who do abortion doulas. So a lot of them have been able to tell me that for us, we believed that we practiced abortion. We didn't really have a word for abortion. A lot of tribes, they don't have a specific word in their language for abortion. They just kind of have more of talking about what makes your period come. And so that's more around it. And we definitely, this is something that I've really been thinking about too, because with religion, and I almost forgot to mention that we also provide support in having, like after an Indigenous person has an abortion, we can provide some spiritual guidance as much as we can, get them in touch with a spiritual advisor of their tribe. We try to do that as much as possible. Yeah, I can only talk personally for my own tribe. So for Navajos right now, if you would ask a Navajo, they would probably say that abortion is bad and not to do it. But that goes against our traditional teachings, because the Navajo tribe is a pretty colonized tribe, honestly. A lot of our it was more of a survival tactic to assimilate and completely give in, rather than, give any type of opposition. And we saw how that was going with a lot of other tribes. So we wanted to try to save as much as ourselves as possible. So we had abortions. We didn't have them nearly as much as we do now, because just the climate was different. It was in times of domestic violence. It was, of course, completely the choice of the mother. And back then, mothers and women and femme and two spirits had much more bodily autonomy. So it wasn't that big of an issue. And it definitely, we took it very serious though, just like we do now, how, it's still something that can impact you heavily. And it can be, you carry with you throughout your whole life. So we had ceremonies for when somebody had an abortion, things like that. And so, yeah, there's a lot of tribes nowadays, they don't talk about their history with abortion because it's so stigmatized as well. But yeah, right now it's just, with the majority of tribes, it's very anti-abortion. I believe there was, I'm forgetting her name right now. I'll probably see and try to remember it again. But there was one of the chiefs of a Lakota tribe. She tried to open up an abortion clinic on their reservation, and they couldn't have impeached her fast enough. It was pretty ridiculous. She had a lot of negative energy just kind of pointed at her, a lot of like just threats, bad things, just because she wanted to give that option to her tribal members. And that's the only time that, at least post-colonization, that someone's ever tried on a reservation to open up an abortion clinic. But yeah, that's kind of where it stands religion-wise. It's very varied, but I know that quite a few tribes, it was traditionally okay.
I think this goes back to just the policies in general, right? Of just forced assimilation, residential schools. I think there's this idea, and it happens with a lot of our communities, right? I've seen Black communities have this put against them, and Latinx communities put this against them, where it's like, well, you guys must be very liberal, right? You must be very democratic. You must be very left on the spectrum. And that is just not the case. And I know Barb and I have had a lot of conversations about this assimilation piece and what our people have done to ourselves in a lot of ways. And I think that's why it's shocking to me what the traditional values are versus where our people are now, and just the wide array. And even some of the traditions that we have as Paiutes are a little confusing, because it's like a lot of this feels very patriarchal. It feels very centered in Christianity, even though that was not us. But that is what it's become because of residential schools and because of that forced assimilation. And so, this has also opened up a can of worms for me, because I've seen a lot of people, and Jeanette and I have talked about this a ton, calling for tribal governments to go ahead and just like, well, we'll go ahead and just do this on tribal land, which is a fascinating concept to me, because it's like, of course you can't just do something on tribal land. And it's interesting because sovereignty is only a pro for our communities when it's convenient for white people. And so sovereignty is bad when it comes to prosecuting people. Sovereignty is great when it comes to getting abortions on tribal land. And when it comes to dictating what we want, whether that's putting up solar panels, whether that's putting up a pipeline, whatever the case may be, all of a sudden everybody is very con sovereignty. But when it's convenient for white folks, then sovereignty is the absolute rage. And so I've seen people calling for abortion clinics. I've seen people calling for, Jeanette told me recently about somebody wanting to give out abortion pills on tribal lands. And that was weird, because they were like, let's do it in a van, which is fascinating to me, to like drive a van and hand out abortion pills. Like that's a whole other just weird, creepy thing. But it's just, we have so many weird, convoluted, mismatched ideas, I think, as a people.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up. I was actually just going to ask that, not necessarily the tribal land, but also the federal land piece, right? Because I saw it suggested this week by one of our favorite folks that we should put abortion clinics on federal land or adjacent to national parks, or, I mean, they're just thinking of all kinds of creative solutions now that suddenly, I guess we didn't think of before. So, Taylor, what's your response to that? Obviously, yes, the tribal land piece, that's actually what prompted the show, as I saw Jeanette put up a really interesting article about that conversation of, putting abortion health centers on tribal lands, but it's bigger than that, right? It's also the conversation around federal lands, which were your land as well. And how do we start to navigate this whole thing of like, when it's convenient for white people, they want to do these things, but before it was never a conversation we wanted to have.
I mean, I think that's the point of Indigenous Women Rising. I think that's the point of NVAN, is forcing people to have these conversations when it's not convenient for them, because I hope that even with just the little bit of time we've had these organizations, that they have educated people a lot about what the perspective is for Indigenous people. But Indigenous sovereignty and the topic of sovereignty is so foreign to people, and it's even confusing to Native people about what that means and exactly how that works within our communities. I was just trying to explain to my husband how tribal courts work, and he was like, all of this is so contradictory. How does this even work? And I'm like, it doesn't. And that's exactly the point, is these topics are convoluted on purpose. The system is working exactly as it was designed. And I think as many weird loopholes as you can find with tribal land, federal land, public lands, whatever the case may be, if the government, the quote unquote powers that be, not to sound very tinfoil hat, but if the powers that be decide they don't want abortion anymore, that's what it's going to be. And so as many loopholes as you can find are loopholes that are going to be closed. And I don't mean to be so doom and gloom about it, but we need a big overhaul, a big system change. We need to stop seeing women's body as public property. We need to stop seeing Indigenous land as public property. These things all deserve autonomy. And I've learned so much from Barb and so much from a lot of the Indigenous women in my life, and even Jeanette, about all of these topics. But it's just like, there is so much misogyny baked into this country and baked into everyday life. And I just was saying today, it's fascinating because we don't say kill the Indian, save the man anymore as a government, but those things still permeate. Those things are still affecting us today. That, and with Gorsuch and a lot of these folks, there is this absurd fascination with Indigenous people and Indians and this weird warrior myth, and almost this reverence for us as a people. But again, when it's convenient and when it's for them and when it's helpful to them. And so this is both women's rights, Indigenous rights are a big need for an overhaul. And that's the end of it. I don't know how we make such a big, giant change, but I think it's definitely organizations like ours help.
I couldn't agree more. You've educated me on so many issues, all of you. Barb, I want to come back to you. Before we get to the Castro Huerta decision, I want to talk about your reaction to the Roe versus Wade decision. It's something you and I have talked a lot about over the years, about where we're going in this country and where we've come from and how it impacts people of color, Indigenous people. What was your reaction when you heard the news around Roe versus Wade and the Dobbs decision? And what are your feelings about the impact it's going to have specifically on Indigenous people's lives?
Knowing, like I said, like it wasn't known that this was going to be rolled back. Like the preparing for it and just knowing it. Sorry, it's my dog. He decided he wants to not be part of it. I'm a mother. I was a young mother. And it was my decision. It was my choice to become a mother. I made that choice. And there is a lot that goes into it. And in my decision to become a mother, especially a young mother, really was dependent on my grandmother. When I went and told her, because there wasn't this taboo about whether you could have an abortion or not. It just wasn't a conversation, but we knew it existed. And so when I went to my grandmother to let her know that I was going to be a mother, she's like, that's not the worst thing to ever happen to you. You do have a family to support you. This is our resistance to have a little Indian boy brought into this world. And she gave me that peace. But not everybody has that. Not everybody has the ability to think like that, have that support system, or understand really that root of why someone would choose to become a mother. And while I thought it was wonderful and great, my son is now 20 years old. And we've been through a lot as a single mother, raising him, that looking back of like, it is not as much of a noble decision as it could be portrayed to be a young single mom, to force that energy on folks to think that, oh, if you do this and you make all these decisions, that somehow you get to sit in a better space. You really don't. You live in a life of worry of like, what did I bring my child into? What decisions did I make? What impact did I have? Is he happy about my decision? He didn't have a choice in the matter. I brought him in here into that. So when I think about the decision, it's a choice, and we should be able to have the right to sit down and think about, do I want this path to be a mother, or do I not want this path to be a mother? And it is nobody's business, and it has nobody's space in it, because even if you want to use religion as your reason for, I don't see in there where it's a jury by trial. Or trial by jury. So where do you think you have the right to dictate and determine what people can and cannot do in that space? And it's a very hard decision. These are hard decisions to have. And of an understanding why you would choose to go forward with having a child anyways. Even in this time frame, I have a 6-year-old daughter, and honestly, I tell you, it feels like it was the worst decision in my life to ever bring that child into this capacity. And I'm being brutally honest, and I tell my children this. I don't have dishonest conversations with my children. I let them know, and I let them know why. Why would I want to bring a daughter into this where she has absolutely no rights? She had more rights as a fetus in my body than she did actually living and breathing. I have to worry about whether if I send my child to school, she's going to be shot down like a dog, the same way as my ancestors were, the same way as when they were carted off to residential schools and those bodies are still buried in those grounds. And you talk about making this decision on who can and cannot have a body. Why do people who descend from the death sentencers have the right to determine who gets to have a child and who doesn't? You don't have the hill. That's not your hill to die on. You don't have that, especially here in this space, in this nation, for the crimes that you have committed on Black, Indigenous, and women of color since you came here. So when it comes to that, I'm really pissed about it because, like I said, it is a choice. Just because I have a children does not mean I get to enforce that onto everybody else. It is everybody to have that decision to decide whether they want to have those children or they don't want to have those children, and be able to be realistic about what it is to have a child. Are they going to have medical needs? Can you afford those medical needs? You don't want to cap insulin for people, but yet here you want me to have a child with type 1 diabetes and not have a say-so in the matter. You want to sit there and say, oh, well, we don't want your insurance to pay for folks who are going through kidney failure. And if it's not possible for them to be okay on dialysis 5 years, well, your insurance can determine that they don't want to pay that for you. How pro-life is that? So when I think about those things, it really does play into capacity of every day in my space of coming from women who didn't have a choice whether they had children or not, or when they did have children, they didn't even get to keep those children. And then myself having children and having to live and explain intergenerational trauma, why we have to leave spaces that we left, what it means to be who they are, what their identity is, and how they fit into a world and how they don't, and how this world actually was not built for them or created for them to keep them safe in any way.
And I do find the what is it? This freedom of religion case very fascinating, and Christianity in America, because you're coming from a time when our grandmas weren't even allowed to practice our religion. Our religious freedom has never mattered in this country. We were not allowed to do ceremony. We were not allowed to powwow. We were not allowed to sing and dance and do all of these things. And so if it were somebody that was sitting there at the I don't even know if the 50-yard line is a real thing. I have nothing to do with football, but sitting there at the 50-yard line doing an Indigenous prayer, they would not have that. We can't even wear a feather in our cap and gown to a high school graduation. Do you think they would be so friendly if it were an Indigenous person doing that? When it comes to keeping our men's hair long, when it comes to keeping feathers in graduation caps, they will have none of that. And they have never had none of that. And that's this strange thing. And I feel all of Barb's anger of bringing a child into the world in this capacity, because it's so reminiscent of what our grandparents did. And I can't think of a time that it's been so restrictive in my short little life. And I've known these things, and I've heard these things from my grandparents, and I've heard these things from our elders, but it's just so reminiscent of what they went through. And it's so very odd to live in this weird theocracy almost. And I can't, you have all of these politicians that are talking about what the founding fathers intended. And we have such a reverence in this country for the founding fathers. And sure, were some of them stand-up guys? Maybe. I don't know. That's not really my thing to say whether or not. But the bottom line is they were white Christian land-owning men. And they intended this country to work for white Christian land-owning men. And that's the end of story. They didn't intend for it to work for Barb. They didn't intend it to work for me or you. This is exactly what they intended, was for our rights to be taken away. The merciless Indian savage should live no longer. And that was what this was. Not our children, not our children's children. And being here is an act of resilience. And so when it comes to these topics, we have to know that this system is working exactly as it was designed to, period.
Taylor, I want to ask you a question. And, something that Barb brought up is really important to me in this conversation. This topic of abortion intersects with so many different issues. It intersects with the economy. It's an economic issue for so many people because, like Barb said, it's a cost to have children. But it's also a health decision for many people. You are someone who, lives with a disability. That often plays into people's decisions of whether or not to have children. Or you could have a child with a disability, like Barb, with insulin costs and various other things you have to take into consideration. And, we're not doing anything to address healthcare in a real way in this country. So talk to me about the importance of continuing to talk about abortion as an intersectional issue with other issues that we have the privilege to work on every single day.
It's so extraordinarily intersectional because all of those things feed into each other. And it really is abortion access, women's health care, period, is about economic freedom. We can talk about the pay gap. That's partially in having children. You can talk about all of these economic issues, but really disability to me is the last frontier in a lot of ways, because I think it is a topic that is it affects so many people, but so many people still don't understand it and understand how to make things accessible for people with disability. Because I think, and I've encountered this a lot as just a sort of invisible illness person, where people have a very specific idea about what disability is. They have the paraplegic and they have a blind person and maybe a deaf person. That's what disability is to them. But disability is a very wide range of things. The things that are going to work for a person in a wheelchair don't work for me accessibility wise. And when we talk about healthcare in this country, I couldn't even get married because I was going to lose healthcare. And even stuff like trying to get healthcare for my staff and trying to get healthcare for me and my husband it's gate kept in a very weird way. And you're having to reach all of these different barriers. And so I had been very fearful for a very long time of accidentally getting pregnant because I was on controlled substances. So if my two choices now today, luckily we're in Nevada where we do have abortion rights codified, protected. Our governor is very friendly on abortion access and abortion rights. That's phenomenal. But if I was in another state, my choices would be to use Indigenous Women Rising to go get an abortion somewhere else, travel possibly miles and miles and miles to do that, or to have a baby be addicted to drugs when it was born because of my controlled substances I'm on. Or I could try to go off of those and have a miscarriage, which I may not be able to get a DNC and get the healthcare access that I need for that. So you're really boxing disabled women in. There's almost no way that you can cope with those things. And the fear of bringing a child into the world when I was very, very sick, when I was unable to leave my house for any period of time, no one should have to struggle with that. Nobody should have to feel like they might lose everything by having a child. It's insane to me that forced birth is even a question, that it's even a topic that we have to talk about. There's no way in hell that I should be forced to have a baby. And then that baby should be forced to have to deal with my health issues or the health issues I have given it because of my disability and the medications that I'm on or the things that are wrong with my body. So I find disability to be the last frontier in a lot of ways, but specifically within reproductive rights, I think you have a lot of issues. And I've seen a lot of young women that have the same chronic illnesses that I have are trying to get sterilized and are unable to because, well, gosh, you might change your mind. Yeah, I don't know. You're so young. You don't have a husband, or you do have a husband. What does that husband think? God, I don't know. He might want to have children. And so we never question men in that same way, ever. If a man decides something, that's what he decides. And that's phenomenal. Bravo, my man. And so I just want everybody to feel that freedom of, if you want to get sterilized. That's fine. If you want to end up adopting later, cool. But we need to stop treating women as though they're children and cannot possibly make a life-altering decision because we do it literally every single day.
Thank you for that, Taylor. Jeanette, I want to bring you back in, and I'm going to keep going on this. I don't see a whole bunch of questions in the chat because I think y'all are just, providing so much content here. It's captivating. I know my staff is really into this tonight. Jeanette, I want to talk to you about the slippery slope to hell that we're on right now with all rights, including people who have uteri. So one of the things that I am very concerned about as a person who does not want children and have made that decision with my husband, not because of my husband, but with my husband, I take birth control for birth control purposes, but I also take it because of a medical purpose. And I have debilitating periods. I have debilitating headaches that come along with those really serious migraine issues. And so I have to take my pills a certain way because of those issues for medical reasons. What happens to people if they don't have now access to birth control eventually? Because I believe the Supreme Court is headed that direction with Clarence Thomas's dissent, and potentially going to impact our LGBTQ plus family. They're going to impact other issues that were based on privacy potentially. Where do you think we go from here on that? And why is birth control and people having access to birth control so important in this moment?
Because people have the right to control their bodies. That's just like the point blank period. People should have access to whatever they want for their bodies, honestly. Honestly, sorry, my brain is operating at not the best. Yeah, it's been a long week of clients and lots of things.
I do have a story to share about this, actually, Annette, because I can't shut my big mouth. But I will say this in case Jeanette needs extra time to think about things.
Yeah, and hop back in, Jeanette. This is an open platform, Barb. Y'all jump in. Yeah. This is your show. I'm just here moderating.
I also cycle my pills, and I had been on the birth control shot for a lot of years. I decided I want to move to the birth control pill for a bunch of reasons. And my doctor had written it so that I could cycle it. I called to get my newest prescription, and they were like, "Oh no, sorry, you're too early." And I told them, I'm like, "Well, I've been taking this pill this way for months now." And they're like, no, you have to call your doctor to have him rewrite the prescription. And I said, well, as it is a Friday afternoon and, he won't be until Monday, so I guess I just don't have birth control then. And they were like, yeah, I don't know. And I said to them, I go, well, it's funny that you mentioned this because we did just pass a law that pharmacists can now write birth control prescriptions. Or do you guys participate in that? Can you go ahead and write me a prescription? They're like, no, we've never heard of that. Sorry, we don't do that. But I think that speaks to the importance of, I felt in that moment, like, okay, so is like the punishment here, is it just pregnancy? Is that what this is you weren't forthcoming enough. You didn't prepare enough. You didn't have your doctor write it exactly right. My man doctor didn't think of me in every moment while he was writing this. And so is the punishment at that point birth? That's it. I messed up. So now I have a child. It's so, the logic to me is just astounding that it's like, I have to do this whole other process to get a medication that's not a controlled substance, that's extraordinarily cheap for manufacturers to make. It's cheap for my insurance to reimburse. There's absolutely no reason that it cannot be administered by a pharmacist or even a pharmacy tech. You're not going to harm yourself with birth control. You're not going to go sell it on the streets to all of these birth control drug dealers. It's a completely absurd thing. And I am so excited for that particular law that was passed for pharmacists to be able to prescribe this, because as it gets more widespread, as pharmacies start employing that, I think it's going to be extraordinarily helpful, because you just forget. Sometimes life happens, you're on other medications, things are happening, and you might not have thought of it until a Saturday or a Friday afternoon. And that should be okay, because I guarantee you, if someone went in there for a Viagra, they'd be like, no problem, we'll get you a couple days worth.
Yeah, every 3 months, because I get my pills in 3-month batches, I have to go ballistic on the pharmacy to be able to get my pills the right way, because I cycle them, right? And because I can't have a period anymore because it's actually harmful. And that's nobody's decision, but that's between me and my doctor. And by the way, my doctor did write it the right way. The reason why mine won't happen is because my insurance will only cover it if it's within this time period to this time period. And they've made no exception for women who need, or people who need to take their birth control any other way for any other reason, because people take birth control for a plethora of reasons. Barb, you want to jump in here? I'm sure you got rage to share on this.
Birth control. I mean, it's insane to me. I mean, it's just abstinence. They literally are just that's literally it. Like, the only way is abstinence, because apparently it only takes one person to create a child and bring them into this space. And as someone who is a single mother who's raised my children on my own, somehow that makes me the bad guy, or I'm a villain, because you should have just kept your kid legs closed if you didn't want children. But then when you make the choice that, yes, I do want children, you're a single mom, so that's not great, and you didn't follow what you needed to follow. And so, but as speaking of birth control, with that, there's numerous amounts of birth control. There's different types of birth control. For me, it makes me extremely sick. It makes me extremely ill. It makes me want to be the person who is going to harm somebody or myself. And so finding that you're able to, use an IUD or something like that is long-term, and seeing that there's a possibility that you will not have access to that. Or someone like my sister, who also has 2 children, and it was very, very hard on her body, extremely hard. So for her to have another child would just be detrimental to her health. And so for her, when she's like, well, actually, I want to go get my tubes tied. And they're like, we need your husband's permission. You're still in your 20s. She's like, I have 2 children. I'm in my 20s, correct? But also, why can I not just get my tubes tied? I don't want to have children anymore. And she's like, and this is not an easy decision for me to make, because yes, I absolutely would love to have more children, but my body cannot sustain having more children. And that was the same thing with my mother, who had 5 children. By the time she got to my youngest sister, there's no recovery from that. And you go to a doctor and they're going to tell you, oh, you're fine. You don't need anything. So when we think of birth control, it's not just to prevent birth or any of those things. There's a lot of health that goes into it. There's a lot of reasons why birth control is something that you want to take for health reasons, as Taylor was saying. And so not having access, or not even being able to be honored as an adult to make the decision on what that looks like and how I want to take that is ridiculous. Or say, I don't want to take birth control because it makes me sick. And the next, I'm sexually assaulted, and they're like, you have to carry that baby to term. I don't want that baby. I don't care if it makes me a good person or a bad person. So, and then saying, oh, you should have kept your legs closed, or you should have been on birth control. I don't have access to birth control. Make up your mind what you want us to have access to. And if it's just abstinence, I get that that's your form because you're forced to have that, and that's your problem to deal with, but you shouldn't be enforcing that on anybody else.
Jeanette, I want to bring you back in for one other question before we're going to go a little bit over tonight, because there's a lot to talk about here. On the topic of abortion, one of the things that I talked to one of my friends in the news this week about is, yes, Nevada does still have safe, legal abortion. Thank goodness for our foremothers who put that in the Nevada revised statutes and codified it. So we still have it here when other states do not. And it is something I'm very thankful for. However, historically in Nevada and in other places, our rural communities do not have the same access to abortion services as people who live maybe in Clark County or Washoe County. That disproportionately impacts communities of color, and that disproportionately specifically impacts our tribal communities here in Nevada who live in those rural communities. What should we be thinking about, and how should we be thinking about the future of abortion services in Nevada and other rural places so that all of the people who need abortion services can access them?
I think probably thinking of it more as just, just general healthcare. There's so many issues with access for rural communities, and I get so upset when people are like, "Oh, we'll just have them Uber or Lyft there." Oh, that sounds nice. Why hadn't we thought of that? It's just not possible in those communities. So a lot of people forget about them when they when people are opening abortion clinics. They forget about all the rural communities, and they're like, all right, let's do it in a city that'll encompass all of this area. It requires much more consideration for the rules and like tribal folks, because most tribes are in rural areas. It's overwhelmingly rural. So just with that, I guess the only solutions that I can think of to that issue are maybe even abortion clinics could offer some type of help, even if it's, hey, you have to travel really long distances, let's take off, I don't know, $100 off the cost of your appointment, because I know that's an extra barrier to coming to your appointment. Yeah, honestly, Lynn, folks considering that,
and I also think telemed is another important kind of thing to think about in the future, especially for our rural communities or our tribal communities, because, maybe we can have access through that with medication abortion and other things. What are your thoughts around that?
It would be nice, but the big barrier with that is the lack of internet connection in order to get those abortion pills mailed, and telemedicine where they have medication abortion on demand. So it's, there's just so many, you come up with a solution and then there's a barrier to that solution. So there's a lot of just kind of infrastructure problems that need to be solved first. And then too, most tribal members in the rural areas, they don't have actual addresses. They have PO boxes that they get things delivered to. And I mean, even if an Indigenous person living on tribal land were to be able to have the internet connection to get, have an appointment over telehealth and then get the pills mailed to them, they would have to probably, if they're underage or there's only one car, which, that happens pretty often within tribal communities, is just maybe one car. And then it's maybe quite a drive to go to your PO box. You would have to ask somebody that you trust to drive you to your PO box to get open. And so that's just even more barriers. How are you going to tell somebody, hey, I need to go to the PO box right now because of something? And it offers very little privacy. So there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done in improving access to healthcare in general for rural communities, not only tribal communities, but rural communities in general.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's why I wanted to make sure we address that, because there are so many barriers still that exist, even for states that do have legal and safe abortion. Taylor, I want to come back to you. We're going to pivot really quickly to some of the other cases, but really the other particular case that impacted the Indigenous community this week. How do you think the Castro Huerta decision will impact criminal justice for tribal communities all around the country now?
I mean, this is so infinitely.
And I guess before we go any further, Taylor, I also think it's really important. Explain what the case does, because it's a lesser known case because the abortion case got so much attention. It kind of sucked the oxygen out of some of these other really important decisions that were made that were horrific this week.
Yeah, I think of course, we're always in the background. It's erasure as always. But when you're wedged in between the Clean Water Act and Roe versus Wade, it's kind of, you don't really get top billing, which is fair. And also it's affecting tribal communities, which of course is a more niche community anyway. So a lot of people haven't really tuned into this other than tribal advocates and the very small amount of people that are tribal law advocates as well, which is even more small. Essentially, this was a state a case against the state of Oklahoma, and putting this in as small layman's terms as I can, it allows the federal government and the state to prosecute on tribal lands. There's a lot of caveats to this. It essentially limits the tribal sovereignty. It limits the tribal government's power. You would think, just, like Law 101, that if you commit a crime on tribal land, that the tribal government, the sovereign nation, would have the power to solely prosecute that crime. However, that's not the case. And it adds to the complexities of a lot of this tribal law. It adds to the complexities that our people are facing when they're victims of crimes. And it's also just, it creates all of these contradictions within our communities about how these cases are being handled. It's also interesting to me because when it comes to MMIW cases, when it comes to our missing murdered Indigenous women, when it comes to crimes against our people, the federal government, the state governments have never been super friendly to our people. So it's interesting that they now would like more jurisdiction over our lands and over the people within our lands, because they've never really wanted to help us with our cases in general. And so we've always had quite a struggle to get people to help fight with these man camps, to help fight with our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. So, heck, maybe now they'll actually start to do something about missing murdered people, but I very much doubt it. Also, this takes a lot of just sovereignty away from the previous McGritt decision, which was highly celebrated within Indian country and was really exciting because it ruled about the state of Oklahoma and the just big giant swaths of Indigenous land that actually are there. So that's the way I can understand it. It's infinitely complex, but it's also just a lack of tribal sovereignty again.
Barb, I want to bring you into this conversation because I know we've talked a lot over the years about sovereignty. You've taught me a lot about it. Why is it so important for tribes to be considered sovereign governments? And why is it so important for the federal government to recognize the sovereignty of these nations? And how does that all work? How has the history of sovereignty worked in this country?
I mean, the importance of sovereignty is the acknowledgement of us as the Indigenous peoples of this land. Like I said, we weren't just born with sovereignty, or tribes didn't just come up and have sovereignty. There's a whole history of where sovereignty came in and why that was given to our nations because of what had gone to us, and that we were still here, and that we were still on our lands, and that we were still deemed a government to government relationship, and that we have the sovereign rights because we did not have any rights. We were not citizens of this country. And as we said, being able to be a sovereign nation means to say, no, you cannot take my child to a residential school against my will. It means, no, you cannot come into our ancestral territory and break the laws and not respect our ways. So sovereignty was given to us, not given to us. It was our lands, but as a path happens of sovereignty, it's extremely important. It's extremely important to determine how we operate our businesses. If we open a casino on our reservations, if we build housing on our reservations, how we bring in an industry and business into our reservations, it is important to bring along the laws and the rules that go with that. How we have our own tribal councils, we have our own elected bodies that represent us and move our small governments, in some places very large governments, in those spaces. You're not going to go, if someone commits a crime, if a U.S. citizen goes and commits a crime in Canada, the U.S. isn't going to go over there and prosecute them in Canada. And that's what you're telling us, that they're committing a crime and you're coming into our territory and you're going to prosecute them for that crime when you would not do that to any other sovereign nation. And that means that you are not acknowledging us as a sovereign nation. That means you are not honoring our treaties. You're not honoring what you have abided by, and you are superseding our rights to govern and to say, no, you do not have the right to come in here and prosecute. And it also is acting like our tribes do not have their law enforcement agencies, their tribal courts, or any of that. We already have those systems in place. So, and there's already a process that goes through that when someone is being prosecuted on tribal lands, and they could also be prosecuted outside by the states or the federal government, then they have the ability to request that of the tribe after the tribe has done their due process with that system. And so it's just superseding all the rights and abilities that was already built there, and not giving acknowledgement to why. And so when we think about abortion, of like these states who are saying there's zero, and if you wanted to build an abortion clinic on a tribal land at this point, you could be prosecuted by that state. You are not protected by federal law anymore. They can now prosecute you. So there goes your idea that you had of that. And so you should not really have to only think of it in that capacity of how does it benefit you and how it benefits us. And these things gave rise from missing, murdered Indigenous women. It was the ability to be able to prosecute non-natives who were committing domestic violence crimes and such as trafficking crimes around these man camps. And now you've completely taken away our bill. You're saying, no, we get to supersede your rights to do that. And so for me, as like I said, it's not shocking. The fight for sovereignty has been long-standing. Like, we have a history of our tribes being terminated and not being federally recognized. We have multiple nations that are still not federally recognized by tribes. We haven't seen that from when we had the tribe that was not federally recognized, who were in standing since 1492 when they came over and such. And so they didn't even have the ability to be federally recognized on the very lands that they still existed in. And so when we think in that capacity of like, it's a constant fight. It's a constant struggle. There's already so much red tape. There's already so much hardship to even do anything on our lands and to have businesses and to do any of that. And there's no respect or regard into that, and that you get to just come in and dictate and determine down. And you wouldn't do that to any other sovereign nation. You wouldn't not respect any sovereign body to do that.
I think it's important to remember too, literally all we have as a people is our sovereignty. That is the only thing that we have been able to keep, and that we have fought for generation over generation over generation from 1492, but really from Manifest Destiny and the Indian Removal Act onward. It was a fight for every single generation. Every generation was taking things to the Supreme Court to get that sovereignty. Every generation was getting inch by inch our sovereignty back, our identity as a people back. And that, as Barb mentioned, is for the lucky ones that were able to be federally recognized. For a lot of people that were not federally recognized, this left them in no man's land. They were not citizens of the United States, and they were not citizens of a tribal government or a tribal nation either. But these are modern issues. Like I said, it did start Manifest Destiny, but these are issues that our grandparents, our cousins, our parents, all of those people have taken to the Supreme Court. They've taken through tribal courts, through state courts, and they have earned these rights because we are sovereign people. We do not belong to this country. And it started when we were property of the Department of War. But we deserve, and we have fought for every single right that we have. And Barb is absolutely correct in that no other sovereign nation would be expected to not prosecute people. No other sovereign nation would be expected and would be treated the way that we have as a people. And it is very rich for this country to act as though it respects us and to have little, Native American Heritage Day and all of these things, and then simultaneously stomp on our tribal constitution, stomp on the treaties. Of course, it is no surprise that the U.S. government is not honoring their treaties and not honoring its people. But the fact of the matter is we don't have to take that anymore. Our ancestors have laid down their lives, their bodies, their blood, sweat, and tears, so that Barb and I can sit on here and talk shit, and so that we can then take another case to the Supreme Court and another case to the Supreme Court and never stop fighting, because we have a platform now. We have lawyers, we have a little bit of money, some of us, some of our tribal governments, and we can fight back now. And this is absolutely unacceptable. And as I said earlier, they're coming for the Indian Child Welfare Act next, but we are not going to have our children taken away and given to white families anymore.
Jeanette, I want to bring you into this as well. You know, I am now concerned about an unwarranted or unwelcomed police presence from outside police, not from tribal governments, but outside police on tribal lands trying to make decisions for Indigenous people. What are you hearing from the community about that? And are folks within Indigenous governments or tribal governments concerned about this as well?
So for the police present on tribal lands, they definitely don't want any of anything on tribal lands like that, because tribal lands already have enough issues as it is. Or not really issues, but yeah, things that we need to solve and that we need to work on. And that's just an extra thing that is really unnecessary. And the only really reason why we would be doing that and allowing more police onto tribal land would be, there'd be no reason for it. Nobody wants that. I remember in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma governor, I know his last name is Stitt or whatever, but he's not even worth anybody's thoughts. He kind of threatened tribal tribes within Oklahoma. It was very vague and passive aggressive about how Oklahomans wouldn't appreciate if the Oklahoma tribes were to open up abortion clinics on their sovereign land. And the chairman of the Oklahoma Cherokees, he was like, how does this man not even know anything about his own people? He's supposedly, or he is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation, yet he knows nothing about what's happening on his own lands, and that there wasn't even a whisper of opening up abortion clinics on tribal land because there's already so many things. It's not a priority whatsoever. And like Barb and Taylor have said, that doing that would welcome or would have more police presence, which our people are, along with Black people, are some of the most we have the most fatalities along with Black folks of police interactions. We don't trust police, don't trust the government. All these things are so bad for the land and for our people, and it's too much. I don't know why this whole conversation started with people trying to come to our lands to do this, and they don't even have any thought whatsoever for the people that they're trying to exploit, basically. Hey, I know that we put you on these reservations and traumatized you beyond all hell, but you know what? Now that I'm realizing that, I'm glad that we did that, because now that we fucked things up enough. Oops, excuse my French, I'm sorry.
You never have to excuse your language on this show. We're a fuck family friendly show.
Yeah, so they messed things up enough to where, like, hey, you know what? We have this little backdoor policy where we can go to tribes and try to figure these things out. And literally not a single tribal member, no one from on my organization, or we do exclusively Indigenous reproductive justice organizing, no one mentioned having abortion clinics on tribal land for everybody to access. There has been some folks who are like, hey, maybe we should do it just for our own people, because our IHS clinics and our tribal clinics service only really our people. But still, that is incredibly debated and incredibly, it creates a big, people don't like it. Tribal members don't like it. None of the tribal leadership want to do it. It's just, it came completely from non-natives, this idea. And it's ridiculous. Yeah, we would never put our people at risk like that for more police, and the heightened cases of possibly like MMIW, just non-natives coming onto the reservations. That is a recipe for disaster.
Thank you for that. Okay, I want to ask 2 questions to all 3 of you as we wrap up the show tonight. The first question is, as we're in this moment, how do allies support the work of Indigenous people, not just for abortion access, but for just generally? This is something I think I always ask in this show of like, how can allies be truly better allies, not just, ones that say they are, in this moment when, sovereignty is being rolled back, access to rights are being rolled back, and what do we do in that moment and in that space? Jeanette, I'm going to start with you.
So yeah, there's definitely not just one coverall of go out and vote. That's not how you solve problems like this. There's a majority of things that you can do. You can donate to your local abortion funds. In Nevada, it's Wild West Fund and Indigenous Women Rising. We've also helped out Indigenous folks within Nevada accessing abortion. So you can donate to those different organizations. I would like to ask that folks don't donate to Planned Parenthood because they already have enough money and donations as it is. We really need to focus on the independent clinics. Like if you want to donate to a clinic, find an independent clinic near you. Chances are they probably have like some type of donation process and they need funds. And I believe it's, and support abortion funds, your local abortion funds. And even if you don't have money to donate like some type of resources. You can host a donation drive. You can, whatever what your thing is in life, you can put that towards social justice and helping others. And then, of course, take action, try educating other people in your life, do that work to try to make sure folks don't eat a lot of misinformation. They don't eat a lot of like fake news. So do that work if you're a person who knows your stuff about this. I mean, even if you don't know, you're not an expert in it, you still have some knowledge to share. Like, even if you're watching this right now, you have more knowledge to share to other folks. It shouldn't take a lot of frontliners to have to educate people constantly. And I mean, let's try making a better system that works for all of us.
Couldn't agree more. And for those in the chat, we are putting the link for Wild West Abortion Fund because you should absolutely donate to them if you're here in Nevada. And we're also putting the Indigenous Women Rising link in the chat for the good work that Jeanette is doing this week and has been doing historically, so that we can also support Indigenous people accessing abortion services as well. So please, 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 Jeanette is right. We need to donate to the abortion funds in this country, specifically Wild West and the group that she's working with, Indigenous Women Rising. Barb, same question for you. How do folks in the community become better allies to the Indigenous community? And how do we support Indigenous people at a moment like this that's so critical?
I mean, understanding your history, understanding where you're at, and understanding what you're standing on. None of this is new. None of this is a surprise. And none of this is something that Indigenous people have not been facing since the inception of colonization to this nation. So really, having respect and understanding that when you're out there in this capacity of where you're drawing, there's so much of it to unpack. Let me tell you, just the bare minimum of understanding, like, this is your first time having your rights drawn back. We never had those rights. This is your first time not having access. We never had access. This is your first time of a government telling you what you can and can't do. We've lived under it. A country is only as good as it is how successful their Indigenous people are. And if your Indigenous people are not successful or not represented, or you don't even know who they are, where they are, what they've brought to your space, then you understand that the Constitution based off of Indigenous communities here in Nevada, or in the nation, not Nevada. I mean, it was based off of our history, how we worked with each other, how our tribes maneuvered these lands. And so understanding just the basic of that, this constant conception of like, this is a nation that doesn't have Indigenous people. We're here, we've been on the front lines. And as they said, we do have our own governments, they're sovereign, and that they should be respected, but also understanding that we've lived this timeline. We've lived here. We could probably tell you the whole play by play of exactly how it will play out. And it's a brutal, unfortunate view, and it's hard, and it's something. And then thinking about the Indigenous people who we've had to assimilate into a society that is not built by us, those of us who had to give up identities, give up spaces to exist in this. And so just really understanding the history and what you're really asking from our community, or you're making assumptions based off of some things that you don't even know, or this false history of, I don't know, you're taught of the Trail of Tears. Okay, we did not happily give up our land so that you could have a wonderful place to stay. That's not the history. So understanding that, because this country is founded on a lot of terrible things. It is founded on the mass genocide of Indigenous people and the enslavement of Black people. And that's very real. And until you acknowledge that and understand what that history looks like, why do we have to live it again? Why do you have to have that personal experience in something so terrible and tragic for you to understand what that could possibly look like? Have that allyship with communities when they're telling you this is not good, this is what it's going to look like, and this is what you're looking for, and you're like, I don't know, I have to wait until I experience it. I don't know, I don't know what you're not pragmatic enough, you're not grounded in truth, when all it is truth. This is what this is. So for me, understanding what this is, what you're standing for, even when you're like, the Constitution is this, these are we should go out and vote, this is how we change things, this is, understand that history of how we got to this moment, so that way we can understand how to better move and make a better space when we move forward through this.
And that is why I brought Barb on the show. Taylor, I want to ask you the same question, and then we're going to lean in on this, why we chose to do this episode today. So bring it home for us on that first question of, how do people become better allies, and what should people be doing in this moment to support the Indigenous communities?
I fear this might be my hot take for the episode, but stop talking. It would be like the most polite way I can say it. I've learned since working in the progressive space, this like phenomenal acronym of WAIT, of like, why am I talking? But I think you can't claim to be an ally. You can't be claiming to make space for people while taking up all of the oxygen in the room. And I see a lot of that, of people putting themselves, I've seen men put themselves out in front of this conversation. I've seen a lot of white women put themselves out in front of this conversation. But honestly, stop talking, make space for other people. Every single civil rights movement in this country has been built off of the backs of people of color, specifically women of color. And so this needs to have another movement by our people. And I think we're in the space now that we as a people can be like, get out of the way. This isn't about you. This is about all of the things that we've fought for as a people. And so I love allyship. I love people being accomplices, but I see too much of white people taking up space from people of color. So stop. And I know that is frustrating, because I think when you are a person that's been catered to by an entire society, it feels very uncomfortable to not be at the center of something. But the fact is there are so many better voices than yours at this. And Barb is exactly right. We've already done this. We already know what happens next. And so we are uniquely qualified to deal with this. And so it's just really important to allow people to have space that aren't you. And yes, you can donate, you can vote, you can do all of these things to be good, quote unquote, allies, but please just stop talking. Please. It's my plea for this evening, Annette.
Listen, I haven't had to do a lot of talking today. It's been excellent. I love it. Okay. So Taylor, I want to explain to our viewers why we felt it was so critical. And to be fair, it started as Amber on my team's idea, who has an Indigenous husband and an Indigenous child. We wanted to lift up Indigenous voices as we go into this 4th of July weekend, which I will not be celebrating, because there's nothing to celebrate. What do you have to say, and why was it so critical to do this episode this week with all of this going on in the context of the 4th of July?
I've seen a lot of memes and things recently of like, oh, not celebrating the 4th of July, like there's nothing to celebrate about this country. And I'm sort of like, yeah, we been new. Like, I don't know a lot of Native folks that are like, you know what, like this country, perfection. And it's interesting because, you know, Native people serve at some of the highest per capita rates in the United States military. We have fought for this country. We've died for this country. The country is built entirely on Native lands. So it's really a shame that this country isn't something we can celebrate. And it's sad to me that we have given so much for this place to be built. We've given everything. This country is built on our bones and our blood, and there is nothing here for us. It wasn't built for us, and it continues to break us down at every possible turn. And so it's important any opportunity to highlight Indigenous people, but I think especially when you're celebrating the birth of a country, you have to think about what it was founded on. You have to think about the people that it was founded on. And Barb's absolutely correct. It was built on our land by enslaved people and continues to exploit the labor and the bodies of those people today. So I think on the most serious points, it's about recognizing what this country was actually founded on. And then hosting the show this week is extra important because my birthday is tomorrow. So clearly you were doing something that is extra centered around me. And that's really, truly what it was about, is what I'm going to choose to believe.
Cancer babies. We love our little cancer babies. Barb, Jeanette, do you want to add anything to that? Barb, Jeanette, you go first. You came off mute first. I was like, yo, come on.
Yeah, honestly, everything that Taylor said. I have not celebrated July 4th in a while. Because even then, like me and my cousins, we go out and we used to celebrate 4th of July in terms of just, you know, having fun and drinking and doing recreational things. And so honestly, it wasn't fun to go out for July 4th because most of the time, you know, I'm very white passing as an Indigenous person and my family members are not. And a lot of the time people would come up to them and talk to them while they're drunk and celebrating their freedom. And it's terrible. It's the worst time. I try not to go out on July 4th. It's not fun for me. And try to keep that in mind for all of your friends of color with 4th of July season. Don't try to invite us into spaces that aren't safe for us. So yeah, but thanks for all this. It's so nice to be able to tell folks about how angry and tired, mostly tired this week, because it's just been so much with all of this. But yeah, it's really aggravating. People are like, oh, I'm not going to celebrate now. It's like, oh, that's nice for you that, you know, just now, 2022, the United States isn't working for you. That's wow. And people are just so tone deaf and they don't understand. I don't know. There's a point where you tell them too much and you're screaming into a wall at that point. So yeah.
Well, we love you and we thank you for all of your help this week and all of your work this week. Barb, you want to bring us home on the rage note? Go ahead.
Funny story. While I don't appreciate 4th of July, my very assimilated mother does. She does dress my daughter up in red, white, and blue. But really, what we have pivoted to is there are tribes that their business operates off of being able to sell fireworks. And so being able to give back to the Indigenous community and support Indigenous-based businesses and go ahead and buy like fireworks and that stuff is what we have kind of turned it into in that sense, because, you know, it like Jeanette said, for all friends of color, this is not necessarily a day that is very happy for anybody or celebratory process. And then following up on the same as like Taylor said, we do have the highest per capita that serves in our military. I come from a family of military, even when they were not even United States citizens. So when we think of that, you know, that is a space to give honor to that our family served like that. We could give back to Indigenous based businesses and such, but really actually understand what does 4th of July mean for folks and whose independence was it really? And then seeing this week with the Supreme Court of, well, clearly they like to determine what that actual celebration is for, and that it is not for us. And so taking that into that space of, while this is very hard and this is very heavy, and sometimes it could seem like there is no hope, or as Jonah said, this is exhausting. Really take into that space that, yes, it is exhausting. It's exhausting to be a BIPOC person in this nation. It is tiring and it is never ending and it's always there. And that us being here to this day is our resistance against that we have made it through here, and we shouldn't always have to just be telling stories of resiliency, but stories of uplifting and honoring who we are and where we come from and our celebrations. And so when we think of celebrations, it does not need to be 4th of July.
All right. I want to say thank you to all three of these incredible women who I have the privilege to work alongside every single day and call friends. They're some of the biggest badasses I've ever met. And Jeanette, you keep kicking ass and helping people with their abortions, and we'll be here to support your work every step of the way. Also, Taylor, you're getting a lot of happy birthdays in the chat. So people will be celebrating your birthday instead of anything else. So mission accomplished, my friend. So yes, as you go out this weekend and, you know, potentially have some celebrations or whatever it is that you do over this weekend, keep that in mind, because I think the founding of this country was not a peaceful one, contrary to stories that are told to us in grade school or at national parks when I go there. And we need to understand our real history in this country and understand what this country was founded on and the people who were sacrificed to get us to this point. And so that's why we wanted to do this episode tonight after a week of absolute tragedy and absolutely horrific decisions by the Supreme Court of this country. It was important to center Indigenous voices and make sure that Indigenous voices are heard in this conversation. So I hope you learned something tonight, because they always teach me things and I'm always learning from them. And I hope that you take this conversation seriously, take it back into your homes and tell the people you love about this conversation. Share this conversation with them, because this is a conversation we need to have more of. With that, I want to say thank you all for joining us tonight. I will not be here the next 2 weeks because I am going on a vacation, because I am tired and need to not talk about politics for 2 weeks. So Maria will be here next week. We're going to be talking about inflation and what inflation actually is and is not. So this way you don't have the little Biden stickers on your gas pump, because that's not real. And we're going to be back next week with Out in Front on Thursday night at 5 p.m. So make sure you join us for that conversation. Maria Teresa will be taking over for me the next 2 weeks, and I will see you when I'm back from vacation. Thanks so much, everyone. Stay safe and healthy. COVID is still a real thing out there, and many people around me have it right now. So make sure you're staying safe and healthy this weekend, especially if you're going out and doing things with your family and friends. Stay safe. Thanks, everyone, and hope you have a great weekend. Talk to you all soon.